models as well, like just how to explicate certain concepts to people. I think modeling helps a lot there, more so than prediction even, which, like you said, is like the reflective aspect makes prediction very intractable, but maybe modeling as a way to teach concepts to kind of spread an understanding of certain policies. I think that there's some value there.
Yeah, definitely. I would even go further and say, like, the more you push modeling, the more reflexive you can get. So the stronger the limits of modeling will be in some sense, but at the same time, the more of the reflexive like behavior you could build actually into the social simulation of how people are going to react and so on, the further you can think with the framework. So I totally agree here.
Guys, just so we don't also lose totally track of the matter at hand. No, Christian, thank you so much. Also, Payman, thank you for coming as well. Didn't even say hi. Not sure if you can hear us. Great. How are you?
How are you doing? Hey. How's it going?
So just to give you guys some context of what we set out to do today, we were invited to write a paper for a Slovene journal, but it's quite kind of hybrid journal. They are kind of interested in politics and theory, but they're also interested in art. And so they accepted that we do something kind of flashy and weird for our paper. And we decided to use a kind of a basic diagram we constructed that kind of gives an overview of the sort of landscape that we're trying to work on. And everyone who wants from the group, not everyone, but some of us are contributing with smaller text sections that kind of cut a bit of that diagram and talk about it. So that's the way we found to have a center, kind of a central thing guiding the construction. But since we don't have like a clear unity, we don't have a totally shared conceptual construction, it allows everyone to go on their own way and treat different parts of this based on what they're interested in, and still keep some unity, because it's like there's always a map saying you're here now, right, in this construction. And we met we have, I think, 2 meetings about this. The first one, we pretty much decided that this would be the format. The second one, there were less people in the meeting, so we just took our time to talk about TV series. That was our contribution. And today we're trying to pick up again and go through some of the contributions that are already drafted and talk about whatever people want to, like, if they have ideas to new sections of the paper, and try to organize that a bit better for the final thing, which needs to be handed in on the 29th of this month. So we have about 20 days. From what we set out in the first meeting about this project, we agreed to try to hand in these entries until like in about 10 days from now, so that we have an added 10 days to kind of cross-reference them, try to make them connect a bit more. So first we stitch them all to this diagram, and then we try to find stitching points amongst them and see if they can cohere together a bit more, right? So I think we have a couple of them already drafted. I think Moscardi is not here today, but he's writing something on ecology. We have one that is already drafted, and he's like halfway done. I know John is writing something on the Mongolian Empire and state formation. I'm not sure, I haven't read it. You already added a lot of stuff to it.
Sorry to ask, is this document available somewhere, or is this
private? I can add both of you to our WhatsApp group, and then we can share it with you guys there. It's not, I think it's not available.
Only if you're comfortable. Like I'm not going to spread it anywhere, but I don't.
Yeah, no, I mean, we are obscure by lack of interest from others. We're not obscure, not secret due to any positive attempts. We're just uninteresting to people. So yeah, we're protected by people's disinterest.
Yeah, same for me.
Yeah. So I don't know how you guys want to go about it. Like, because I know other people might want to propose other entries to the text. So I'm not sure if we should go one by one, the entries we already have, and then do that afterwards, see if anyone has other ideas, or if we should do the inverse and kind of just see if there's something to add to the list, and then go through the individual contributions.
Let's get an overview of the list first, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just share the screen here with the folder. So this is the current folder, right? I think that we know this is something I wanted to add, but right now we have I'm not sure, perhaps we can just do it like, I think this first two, they have we know it, they need to come before the others, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure, Yasha, if you want to talk a bit about the stuff that you're writing. Yeah, I think you're writing with Reza, right?
Yeah, it's still mostly in outline form, but I'm trying to organize and condense things. I only just started, just a little bit, starting like an introduction. But I'm just trying to, I think, like, put, I guess, on the table like the more general philosophical commitments that hopefully will set the stage to make this diagram make sense. Maybe when you start introducing it, like why we can even, for example, like say that we can split the world in these 3 ways like this, and the Brahmian nodding and things. I think generally there's 3 different kind of sections. One is the most general overview, which has to do with this thinking of social forms as collections of individuals that are greater than just a sum of individuals, right? It's like a very classic thing. But also specifically about the composition, intelligibility, and interaction triad, and how we kind of want to think all 3 at the same time, and like woven through each other every time we're thinking of worlds or social worlds. Then kind of hopefully an intuitive, like objective phenomenology crash course. I'm trying to do like condense the ideas without any math or category theory, but in my head, it's vaguely in these kind of 3 S words: the seeing, slicing, and scaling. So seeing is like how we switch perspectives in different ways depending on the context. For example, in the primer, it's you always look at how commodities see each other rather than like how whatever like a consumer or a producer sees them. Mm-hmm. And slicing, this is specifically about how, right, we like contend worlds are these infinite things that are sort of infinitely sliceable, and that whenever we name something and like point it out and section it off, that is always like already a certain like, I guess, like spatialized or like topological choice. And then scaling, this sort of like the multi-layered transcendental idea that especially like we want to be thinking about resolutions and always like what is the minimum admissible resolution in any particular context. So when we're thinking about an explicit experiment. And the last kind of main thing is the site as experiment, which is, I guess, sort of like the arrows into the diagram, right? That whenever we're talking about an explicit social world, we want to be moving from like the classic, I guess, leftist critique to something which is more like experimentation, which is how can we do something in the world, learn something about it, and then maybe do something different in the future. That's like a very, very high level, and hopefully I want to get more into it. I just need to talk to Reza about a few things to clear some like more philosophical nuances. I don't want to sound stupid.
Can
I
I ask
don't know
a
if that makes any
conceptual?
sense.
Sorry, can I ask a conceptual question
Yeah.
about this?
Uh-huh.
Like you said in your primer that you don't want to view politics as a science, but then you basically define hypotheses and experiments and actually want to move there. So how is it not trying to like rethink what science means and politics means in a way? Like, why is it not a science? Your political take.
Would you say just because art has experiments that art is a science?
Yeah. I wouldn't. Experiments here isn't a scientific experiment per se, but experiment in the sense of an intervention that you can learn something from, right? And experiments in different contexts mean different things, right? Like, for example, an experiment in love could just be like going on a date, right? That's very simple. But like, what is an experiment in politics? I think is kind of one of the
Pokings,
questions.
yeah, like I would say, we can just substitute it for structured pokings, coherent pokings.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, for me, this is not a strong distinction, but yeah, it's interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I go, Yasha, one thing I wonder about this section is that this seems to be something that already could take easily quite a lot of pages. You know?
That's what I'm most concerned about. That's kind of what I've been, I guess, meditating on.
and I think that there is another thing to consider, which is, I mean, the intro to the diagram and the intro to the approach. I think they need to be very careful, because since the other sections, they're more laterally distributed and they're quite heterogeneous. Like, it's not like everyone agrees philosophically on the basis of everything. I think we should be, let's say, worried about being determining the least necessary for the construction to make sense, rather than to, be very clear with the most. Not only will this give you a lot more work if you need to explain everything. I mean, I'm not even sure we know, but also I think you might over-determine something that we can't really guarantee, that these are like these fundamental assumptions hold for every contribution. Whereas, I think that these three ideas that you mentioned, these four ideas, right? That the whole project relies on the idea that you should displace what counts as a point of view, right? Rather than how, for example, the commodity world appears to you. You want to find what functions as an I in the commodity world, what functions as an I in the state logic, what functions as an I in communitarian relations, right? I think that's a general principle that you don't need to explain metaphysically what allows this to be constituted, or all the steps that you need to admit to do this. Like, you can start from there and people get what you're saying, you're already covered. Otherwise, I think that there are discussions we're still having on more foundational issues, which, first of all, it's not even clear that we need to agree on all of them to begin with. And second, it might give you a lot of extra work,
Yeah, I'm hoping to, as we also progress, to like keep reading through all the other ones and I guess filter through that. So we'll see how it goes.
I think that the seeing idea, the slicing idea, I totally agree that, for example, it's easy to find an example with, again, if you take the perspective, if you agree that what sees an economy is an object of the economy and not transcendentally constituted external subject to it. So money is the point of view rather than the bearer of money. Then what counts as a part in the world, for example, tends to be limited by what is priceable, right? So a priceable part would be, let's say, the way you can slice in a non-trivial way economic parts, for example. And I think that, and then scaling, because when you recompose priceable parts, you don't necessarily get back the object that you decompose in the first place, right? When you recompose the priceable parts of a car, you get commodity capital. You don't get just a car, right? So I think those principles, they apply to all the different logics. They would introduce a lot without having to go too much into, let's say, what is the foundational metaphysical basis that allows you to claim that, right? And I think that from those three, it already follows the problem of experiments, because then if you want to poke, as Alfred says, if you want to poke around in the economic world, you need to construct an object that sees things in the economic world, right? So you have a lot, you already have a lot that allows you to you have enough to construct that fourth point just by constructing these three things, I think.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think that helps actually. I'll think about it.
I mean, I still think that if
And the
people
rest
want to
is
write,
a little bit unstructured. Yeah. Don't judge it too harshly right now, but yeah.
yeah, no, I'm saying this out of solidarity, because when I write like the structure for projects, they always read like these monumental things, and then I managed to write like 2 points, 2 bullet points, right? So just anticipate that this could happen as well. And I think probably you should separate, in my opinion, at least, I'm not sure what you think, but in my opinion, you should probably separate the idea of scaling in the sense that you can slice things and find, let's say, what is logically atomic and non-trivial about it, and you can recompose it. That seems to be the scaling. It could happen inside one layer of our construction, right? So I think we can give good examples of how you can decompose and recompose objects that are solely seen from the standpoint of commodities, and this gives you non-trivial wholes out of previous parts, right? Like new syntheses, right? And that's, you don't need to introduce a different layer to account for that.
Yeah, that's true.
So probably the layering is a separate thing, right?
Yeah, it follows from slicing, I think, but just like
exactly.
It's extreme with like limits on infinite worlds, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So
it's sort of a combo of one and two.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Perhaps slicing and scaling is one thing, like the analytic and the synthetic sides of the same thing. And then layering is something you need to motivate, right? Because that's actually quite uncommon approach. I mean, not totally uncommon, but it's not the usual approach, or not an orthodox approach to divide a social formation into more than one logic. So probably that needs to be a bit motivated. We have a bit of that in the beginning of the other section, the other introductory section, right? Which talks about multiple modes, but probably just the idea of multiple layers could be introduced here already.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. I don't know.
And maybe on point A, we can just talk a bit about, I also did this in my part, but I think this might be the more appropriate place to do it, which is to talk more about how the reduction of problems to the individual level like creates barriers. Maybe talk about like what are the downsides of seeing things in terms of individuals, right? The ideology of human nature, the ideology of like corruption and power struggles and all that stuff, which is, it kind of keeps you trapped in this unproductive cycle. You can't really like think of any collective solutions to things because you're always focused on these like tendencies of individuals. I think that's mainly like why this approach is needed, right?
Yeah, I think that a good way of connecting what you said to point B is that usually you have this trade-off, right? You do methodological individualism, which I think is how this position is usually called, right? Even analytic Marxists tend to approach it in that way, because if you want to use formal tools from economic modeling, usually that's both the internal standpoint of like you start from buyers and sellers and property owners and things like this and desires and things like that. And on the other hand, it also clarifies who you're doing the modeling to, right? Meaning policymakers, academics. So it's kind of a trade-off. It seems like if you want to use formal tools, usually they are connected with methodological individualism, because most of these tools were already kind of developed with this perspective in line. And usually you need to choose. If you want to singularize collectives or organizations, apparently usually you need to let go of those tools, right? And I think that's even something we can use to motivate this perspective, that you don't need to choose between them, because in a certain sense, right, the unit that we are defining for each layer, for example, the money commodity, it is a social structure. So you could already have, let's say, it's not a methodological individualism, it's a methodological, I don't know how to call this, right? It takes as its starting point the structure inside a given operational space that has a kind of universal position, right?
Mm-hmm.
So methodological universalism, I'm not sure how you want to call it. But I don't know, perhaps there's something in this line of argument that helps to connect section A and section B of your text.
So I think there's one central problem that I think any glimpse of the project would raise this problem, which is like, you're saying you want this objective phenomenology, you want this like seeing from the perspective of these non-human entities, right? But then how is that ever going to be useful for politics, which is comprised of individual perspectives and does at some point require some level of, individual interaction or buy-in or cooperation and all that stuff, right? That there is some contact with the individual required. So how do we reconcile this objective perspective or whatever, and the need for subjective, or cognitive mappings, let's say, like mapping to the individual level at some point? We have to somehow address like how it's compatible with that.
Yeah,
or if it's not, I don't know.
Yeah, ultimately I think the goal of it is a sort of maybe like a synthesis of like I guess it's like maybe like kind of postmodern like multiple perspectivism with like the traditional Marxist like look at the material conditions type approach, right? It's trying to, within a specific context, extract what are the operations and relations that can be thought of as universal from certain standpoints.
Couldn't we also?
Maybe that's too ambitious, though.
No, but couldn't we bring your answers with Dennis' question? Just, you say you're diverging from this methodological individualism in section A. You present a lot of points in section B about alternative principles for how you're going to display, like the three principles, they kind of explain how you're going to displace perspective and things like this, right? And section C, I think it's already the best kind of context to answer Dennis' question, because in other contexts, in other situations, other fields, experiments are precisely something that allow you to to have a theory of what you're doing in terms of experiments, is the theory of how you displace from your experience as individuals to something that is mediating, right? So I think that probably what we need to write in terms of, we're trying to understand what a political experiment would mean. Answering that question is also answering the question of, okay, now we reintroduce individual cognition and we ask the question, what are the means that you can displace, let's say, the position from your experience of the social world to something else that can see a bit more of it, right? So probably the section C could be a better place to answer that than section A itself.
Mm-hmm.
No, Dennis, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think it connects what Yasha said about the material conditions of perspectives, right? Because I think what distinguishes us from regular postmodern theory is like postmodern theory doesn't really consider that it just takes as a given that multiple perspectives exist, but doesn't really talk about the conditions themselves, which are shared conditions, right? It's not like everyone has their own conditions for their perspectives. It's actually, there's some material substrate that connects different perspectives together. And I think that's where the site is relevant, because the site is kind of this opaque structure, opaque material conditions that even though you and a bunch of other people might have your own perspectives on things, when you start to conduct these experiments together, when you start to poke around, you see, oh, okay, there's actually this kind of underlying structure that is common to all of them. So I think that does answer the question.
Yeah, that at least could help. And I know Caron wants to write some. I'm not sure if Caron, if you're gonna.
Yeah, I think it's exactly about that, really. I mean, this is exactly the point. I'm actually already doing, because I did just a couple of weeks back a presentation at the School of Materials Research, which was a Salazar critique of Zonretto, and it was exactly that. Like, if let us say Zonretto's thesis is a kind of a materialist construal of the transcendental subject, right? What is the correct kind of mediation between this material substrate and what gets transmitted to a transcendental subject, so to speak? So it is exactly about the mediation between the objective and the subjective phenomenological points of view within this project. So it's exactly about that. But it's not dealing with postmodernism. It's dealing with, Pittsburgh Hegelianism and Zonretto particular construal of real abstraction as a particular case of a social formation that is has causal powers and without being empirically concrete, right? So this is the interesting issue. I'm already doing it because I'm producing now a text version of that for the Latin American version of Crisis and Critique. And what I discussed with Gabriel a few days ago was, well, maybe a smaller version, a more summarized version of that would fit in this project. So yeah, I think this is exactly the place, really.
Yeah, so I mean, probably a good idea would be to have like your summarized version of the text, Caron, and have this version, and then when we have both, we can try to kind of make the connection clearer, right? So Yasha doesn't need to kind of account for everything there because it makes no sense.
Of course. This is too much, of course. Maybe to come up with some kind of categorization. I mean, even if you have two accounts of these, maybe they can coexist somehow within the finished text. We do have to tinker with it, I think.
Yeah, I think that Yasha, if you go only as far as saying, remember in the first argument I made, I said we're moving away from this individual perspective. Yeah, when we get to this experimental point of view, that we can reintroduce the problem in new terms. That might be enough, just so you know that there is another section that will deal with this more directly. So you can prepare the ground to show that this is something that's being considered, but not kind of have to run and work all on your own on it, which again will probably give you more trouble than. I have the impression that just writing this 4 or 5 points here is already going to take like 7 to 10 pages easily.
Yeah, I might.
Yeah.
That's what I'm expecting.
So the idea is to fit my contribution in the C in that.
No, this is the idea is that I think that
I'm just trying to get clear, not suggesting anything. Just,
no, sure.
Just understand it. Yeah.
Currently, the idea is that Yasha's text would be the first. It's just a general introduction to the approach. Then the second
I'm
section,
focusing more on these second two are the more important.
Yeah. But all of this is just one text, which would be a section of around 10 pages. Then after this, we would go to this other section, which we already have like a complete draft. And it starts fleshing out the diagram bit by bit. So we explain that, I think everyone has access to it besides, I think I can post it here. Probably you guys might be able to open it, but it just goes through.
I'm there already.
Yeah. So this here, it ends this section. It introduces these different logics, like, and the claim that there is not only the commodity logic, there are more logics forming social formation. It introduces very cheaply and without enough background, it introduces this basic structure that comes from René Girard's work, and René Guittard's work, not Yves Girard, sorry, René Guittard's work, and it ends with the diagram that we are. So it pretty much constructs a diagram that we are, which is this one.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So for
and
people who
if you want the partial ones, I can make those for you, and also a better version of the.
Yeah, I think that we'll have to. I mean, if you go through the diagram, you'll see I used like another font for C, like capital C, and we have one extra arrow here, right? But for people arriving now, we decided to use this diagram because it has the following thing that's interesting to us, right? We're defining a social formation, and in the case we add here C on top, because C is the dominant mode. And this, if you look at the arrows here, they nicely capture the idea that you have three modes. So the commodity transcendental, the states transcendental, and the community or reciprocity transcendental. You see that KC is formed by arrows coming from each of the three, right? But the complementary relation, so singling out capital and state relations, singling out capital and community relations, or singling out community and state relations, that's actually coming out of it. Meaning that the articulation of the tree has precedence over the articulation of each two, right? So if you decompose the triad, you lose the complements. So it's not like you first have the complements and then you have the triad. And Guittard uses this approach to say, well, I'm capturing something about this Borromean property, which Brownian links have, right? Where if you separate any if you remove any one of the different rings or links, the whole thing is undone, right? But we added this other thing, and if you read the text on the diagram, we're writing this as C like this, which we take to be the space of possible forms of organization. And we're saying that you actually learn about commodity, you learn about state, and you learn about community by poking around in them. So you have, let's say, you can even define the sort of resistance or the sort of perturbation that each form of organization produces into each one of these different logics, right? So vaguely defined, you can say that organizations that pose a problem for exploitation are interacting with the capital logic, right? Those that pose a problem, poke around the issues of segregation, are interacting with the community logic. Those that pose a problem for expropriation are interacting with the state logic. We added an extra arrow, which is none of these three, but is the arrow that goes from this object to this object, which we just call the ecological arrow, meaning that it's the composition of these three, and it's just the big mess of the mixture of different organizations you have forming a sort of, you could say, anti-capitalist organization. So the idea is that everyone is slicing this diagram in one way or another to define where their section is, what part of the project the section is addressing, right? So for example, there will be like things which have a little box around the C, and they're just dealing with pure commodity logic, right? There will be sections that are dealing with what is a political experiment in general, there are sections that are dealing with the state logic under capitalism and things like this. So we use this as a sort of constant map to localize everyone's interest. I think that the thing we're talking about now with the experiment and cognition, it probably would require us to add something else here, which is how the hell does all of this look from the perspective of, you know, a human cognitive agent. So probably, I mean, there are a bunch of things we could do which would be really cool, which is, for example, imagine we have something like a language here, and we can wonder which sorts of kind of political language games map this sort of logic, right? Because there are ways of talking about the world that are attempts to capture information about these logics, right? Or we could do something similar when we talk about, okay, organizations are made up of individuals, right? And this acts on this. So how does this appear to the individual? So we could add this to add the "you are here" when your contribution is added, you know?
It's I have like a question with respect to the organizational point of view. Like here, basically, it's like one object that you have in this diagram that's called org. Do you see like part of the structure that is projected into the capitalist relations also being replicated inside of like the organizational framework of humanity itself? I mean, that's what I guess be like Bogdanov's take, right? You would have like a general organizational structure, and then you like project it into different social formations, so to speak. Or is this basically just holding everything together, and this is this thing that cannot be formalized in a way? Or
yeah, I don't know what you guys think, but though I think when we first decided to call this org, just imagine that, because this was Bogdanov's point as well, right? He didn't come up with the organizational point of view because it's the most neutral point of view. He thought it was the point of view that sees the most about the world that he wanted to mess around with, right? So I think that it fits in that sense, that we're just being much more meticulous rather than conceiving this as unstructured point of view defined by, because for him, he would add all, let's say, all other possible fields of knowledge here, right? And this thing is defined also by the fact that it's also the best point of view to look at biological systems, to look at mathematics, to look at I don't know, a drop of water in a plant, right? And I think we're being more humble than him in saying, okay, perhaps this is not that general. This is only enough to
no, but in terms of thinking about a communist society, you would need to also have like a projection onto some form of diagram. You would need to figure out something, and it would basically also like be like projected out of org, right? So you would expect to, in some sense, lift like the capitalist relations in this diagram and then figure out a projection into a new state of society. And that would be like a revolutionary project, right? It would basically be like,
yeah. If you know how, I mean, this is much, sorry, yeah.
Isn't that kind of how we're thinking of TD? We're sort of bracketing it right now, right? Because it like doesn't exist right now, sort of in society, right? But the idea is that if to be constructed, would be sort of like on top of this.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say, Yasha, that, I mean, this humble arrow here, right? It pretty much means that if you open this up, right, it's full of structure.
Yeah.
Right? We're just not looking at it in this diagram. And I love
I mean to know what it is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this would be to say that we can, I mean, I even thought of adding a section on this, like we could redefine what the transition problem is, right? The transition to communism, simply by the fact that if this structure is rich enough, so if you see more of the world just by looking into the internal composition of this, then by looking at this, then by definition, this is bigger than this. So this is already the structuring principle, and this is the special case, right?
Yes.
So we could talk about a sort of rather than talking, for example, like Aurora Polito does in her text, in terms of increased complexity, which I think it's, I mean, you don't need to be that blunt about it. But if you talk about if you talk about the size of this category, or in comparison with this, which is not defined in terms of complexity, right? It's defined in terms of space of operation, what you can see and do inside of it. Well, the moment that this category is larger than this one, meaning you can see more about the world by talking to your neighborly anarchists and your crazy communist friends, you know, engaging in those activities, then you can do when you engage in a company and with money. Well, the transition has happened, right? Which I think we were thinking in terms of that kind of shift of perspective of combs and optics and so on, right?
And in a way, this is literally like historically was the limitation, right? The Soviet Union was not able to capture the complexity of like a modern society in their like planning frameworks, and like they had these attempts to do it, but they really didn't have the means to, like, even the people who really tried like in the project to figure something out, they had difficulties to formalize this process in many cases.
I think that this is the nice, I mean, this is a personal thing. We haven't really kind of took the time to discuss this, but I think that when you start from this approach, which is definitely weird, but it has the benefit that, well, if this orange space here is really big, it's not made of, let's say, a really good simulation of, you know, of production of goods necessarily. It's rich in organizational forms that are not reducible to TA, TC, and TB, right? It suggests that you don't need to necessarily solve the calculation problem of distributing goods to live in a post-capitalist society. You might simply have a non-capitalist, but still distributed, kind of hybrid, multi.
You need to figure out how to create like consistent economic conditions that are satisfied by capitalism in another like form of structuring the world. So you would need to define like some criteria that are satisfied by the capitalist mode of production, lift it into the organizational space, and then you can project it and figure out all kinds of alternatives and think about the alternatives.
But you see, like the nice thing about it is that since we first turned economy into an organizational problem, the solution is not economical. It's not economical by derivation. It's organization. If you can see the world very well from within this hybrid construct of a lot of different stuff, perhaps there is a very big international infrastructure. Perhaps it's something we can't even imagine right now. But you don't need to necessarily pose the problem in terms that are so close to the, you know, central planning sort of.
Right, but in some sense it's also economical, right? Because like in organizational thinking itself, humans develop like certain concepts of organization because they have like the economic support to do so, and it kind of makes sense like in a certain framework to think about organization in specific ways. So that like if you think of the development of science and thought itself, it also has like a materialist base that needs to be developed. So what is expressible, what is historically accessible to you in the category org itself is a result of the economic process of history. So like you have reflection of economics even in this more abstract space.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But I mean, I'm not gonna go through the whole section here, but if you guys read through it, I think it's concrete enough that people can just, you know, give suggestions. It spends a bit of time explaining that there are two currents within kind of Marxist thinking, one that thinks different modes, different logics sequentially, and one that thinks them as concurrent, right, happening at the same time. So Karl Polanyi, Marshall Sahlins, Diane Elson, and others. In a certain sense, you can even claim Marx, but I mean, we don't need to be pedantic about it. Then we explain what are these different modes. So what is mode A, what's mode B, what's mode C. We need to explain that if you take the author we're basing this on, this Kojin Karatani guy, that he has a fourth mode that we are not using. So I try to give an account of why not, because not using his mode D is something we're going to solve we're substituting for that more experimental point of view, right? Karatani has a theory that socialist constructions, they are kind of a already constituted mode of exchange that exists since the dawn of time. And it seems like too strong an assumption, even for him, because he doesn't use that fourth mode to construct anything in his theory, just claims it's there. So we're taking it out, and rather than having it in, we're putting it as this, restating it as this more experimental point of view, right?
You know, you could even be heretic in some sense. Sorry, also if I'm talking too much, I don't want to hijack your meeting, but you could be heretic in a way, and could even say, like, as soon as you have this way of looking at the world, like from org, and capitalism is just, I think you said this in your technology lecture or a discussion like as well, like a year ago, that like the fact that you basically have access to this more complex perspective on the world already renders capitalism itself kind of like as only one special case.
Mm-hmm.
So you also don't necessarily need to, I mean, you need to overcome it in a way, but you also have already overcome it in a sense by already being able to think in this broader space that goes beyond like the even like the self like understanding of capitalism. So that's not necessarily like a very typical view on what the revolution would look like, but in some sense, having access and getting access to this theoretical understanding is already like providing the ability, right? The access to this design. I think of this now as a design space. So if I would say like, okay, should we have markets or not? Well, we can decide, like, it's a design space. We need to think about what it actually means, and like need to have a frame in which we can reason about economics. It's much more powerful than having to fight specific concrete capitalist institutions. And in some sense, like, I mean, if you would argue with Varoufakis and so on, we already, like in capitalism, through like financial capital and the way the central banks are currently like hijacking by necessity the economy, it's already like kind of the markets are already steered like by external processes and like an organizational framework that is beyond like the traditional realm of capitalism in a sense.
One thing that goes along with what you're saying that we added at the end here is that when you take that perspective, meaning we're trying to shift the explanation that Karatani does, right? Karatani does, look, I can construct a social formation as if it's made of 4 modes. And because there is this 4th mode, politics is possible. So he derives politics from this 4th thing. We're saying the inverse. We're saying because there is a lot of politics going on, and there always has been, we know something about these 3 modes, because a lot of national struggles taught us about what communities are and what's the logic of communities. A lot of, state struggles taught us something about what the state is. So it has this more epistemic power on the one hand, and on the other, it already shows that this is a synthetic model, meaning it's meant to, it's like a Carnapian, the logical syntax of politics. Like, you're trying to take a step back so that you can find what the unified framework under which a lot of different social movements and political struggles, which don't agree amongst themselves directly, you can find a common language for them, right? So it's not analytic. That's
something I think we should really emphasize.
Yeah, it's not analytic in the sense that we're gonna, model how concrete processes happen. It's synthetic in the sense that we're extracting information out of organizations, and this kind of weird operational space is at least a good schematism to navigate why these different models of reality, which already happened. Nobody needs to wait for us to propose particular models of this. This has been proposed by every political movement ever, but it's hard to unify and to not navigate them, right? So it's more of a synthetic project in that sense than analytic, I guess.
But in some sense, in terms of like kind of, if you would think of a meta experiment, like you would try to figure out these structures, then you try to basically validate specific social movements, and you could actually use the synthetic structure also to try to simulate something about them, or like basically analyze them, make like predictions about what kind of relations should be there in this organization, and that gives you like then a validation or an experimental means to validate your model of org, right? So you can even like, in a way, like, I would say it's being scientific about it, but if you think of it just as an experiment, that's okay. For me, that's very similar to
I think that we could think of what sort of, the simulation approach. We also thought about, for example, this would justify, like, for example, a sort of platform for organizations that is kind of constructed on top of this logic should be able, in practice, to help very, very different organizations to share a space, to see where they cohere, right?
Yeah.
So there's
also to navigate conflicts.
Exactly. So so this is the idea for the second text, and those two, so the one Yasha was presenting and this one, they form the sort of general introduction, and this one ends with the final diagram that is then reproduced in every text and kind of messed around with by every other section. But the other sections that have no order yet, we don't know which order they should be in. So Caron, for example, if we can debate if yours should come early on, later on, like be the next one after this one, or something you want to have more stuff before. We'll need to linearize this against our will in a way, right? The best way would be to have all these things kind of like hyperlinked to the object rather than sequential. But
this relates in some sense to what I meant with like natural language as in itself like has a specific structure. It's fundamentally sequential, for example. So if you have to lay out things in text like thoughts, it's also like constraining what can be expressed adequately. So I think these diagrams already help to provide this kind of clue. I really like that.
Then we have I think other sections which are already underway, which is John's section. John, I'm not sure if you want to talk about it a bit. I think
sure. Yeah. I'll share the screen real quick.
Sure. Let me just make you a co-host. There you go.
All right. Cool.
Go to the bathroom.
Is that up for everyone?
Yep. Exit.
Yeah.
Cool.
See it.
All right. So let's see. I think that I'm about 5 pages right now, which is longer than I want it to be. So the first part I might chop down considerably. But basically, I try to just go through the case study of the Mongol Empire using our model to try to account for basically its possibility, like how it was something that grew so quickly and surmounted as many different logistical challenges, cultural difference challenges, commercial challenges as were the case. I've been actually thinking about it, able to hone it in more while we're talking now of the around using the like political experiment organization hypothesis, because what the Mongol Empire accomplished was something that had been attempted by various would-be empire builders across the Eurasian steppe for a couple thousand years at least prior to Genghis Khan and the Mongolian experiment. So you can actually look at the idea of political organizations as experimental filters or something like that. And I use more material from a new book by Marie Favereau, who does more of a social history and actually dives more into the organs of Mongol society, the decision-making bodies, the administrative bodies, and how they transformed and were either kind of created ex nihilo or were more often the case, readaptations of older kind of kinship A forms into a new kind of militarized state form, but kind of mimicking or incorporating the earlier kinship networks. And so it's a better history, I think, than the first one I used in the first presentation, which was much more individualistic and hinged much more on like Genghis Khan as the lawmaker. This looks more at like the organizational view. So I start out from using the idea of the logistical state from Lefebvre. and Toscano's quote around that. This is the part I think I'm going to cut, or at least greatly cut down or incorporate into the next part, just because it's already almost 6 pages and I think it's too long. But the basic idea is to introduce the idea of the logistical state as a problem that comes out in kind of late stage capitalism or imperialist capitalism that is more concerned with creating a space for the maximization of expropriation and exploitation than it is with like any particular industrial endeavor. And so it looks at space differently than a capital endeavor looks at space. And Lefebvre looks at homogenization, hierarchicization, and fragmentation of space as the kind of key operators of how the state deals with space. And so I try to use this basic framework to account for what the kind of problems that the Mongol Empire was effective at solving, to try to show that some of these things that Lefebvre is exploring are not just part of capitalism, but are part of the logic of TB, particularized or instantiated within capitalist space. And so the Mongol case is interesting because within less than a century, you move from a kinship society to a state society to a sufficiently complex state society that essentially fosters a world economy, and one that directly precedes the early European capitalist markets. So you have all 3 exchange operators or intercourse transcendentals kind of at play as real problems that have to be solved under a single regime or a single, you know, group of people and system and philosophy. And so it takes the Mongol Empire as being especially paradigmatic of TB in the way that Marx looked at the British Industrial Revolution as being, for the sake of analysis, you know, pure capitalism. And the Mongol Empire offers us a pure form of TB. The reason for that, and this also hinges on part of our critique of Karatani, is that the Mongolian Empire was a nomad empire. Throughout its entire existence, the Khans maintained a mobile camp, a mobile city, that every member of which was capable of, you know, putting up and taking down in really short order, and lived a life in which logistics were always a day-to-day affair, and in which they were always mobile and were on a constantly shifting terrain. Which, as a side note, I've been wondering if it'd be interesting to explore these guys, like the Mongolian and nomadic perspective as being more affine, and because of the need to kind of like constantly look at different like parallel vectors. But the idea is that when you look at their like strategic effectiveness, tactical effectiveness, a lot of it was direct products of hunting patterns and the kind of tactics that were developed as steppes people, right? So on the one hand, there was a very minimal government structure that had to be maximally logistical, by which I mean it just had to be especially effective and good at solving problems, less kind of what we tend to think of as like bureaucracy. But it also really disproves, and I get into this more later, the kind of romantic image of the nomad, because it was precisely their nomadic character that made them so effective at building an empire. And when you look at the war against the Kipchaks who were on the western steppes, the Mongolians essentially carried out a genocidal campaign against nomads that refused to submit to their nomadic empire, meaning there was no kind of like inherent guarantee that like nomad life as such was protected by a nomad empire. Like overall sedentary life increased under the Mongols, and they encouraged city building, and they encouraged concentrations of population to the point where they actually destroyed cities that weren't on the Silk Road, which is something I'd like to add in, but I'm trying to figure out exactly what to add and what not to. So I also point out that as opposed to the hybrid states, which have tended to be the model of states for Western political theory, like the Roman Empire and the ancient Greek states, and Karatani goes in depth into what he means by a hybrid and structure of world history, the Mongolians actually developed a parallel structure that had more strict separations between a Mongolian empire, in which there was a general notion of kind of like citizens, not citizens, but subjects, and if not rights, at least responsibilities that the Mongol Empire had towards their subjects, versus the construction of a Mongol nationality built on language and ethnic membership, and which controlled for itself the actual political rulership over the Mongolian Empire. But in that process, you had two kind of divergent institutional structures. One was what we call very modern, which implemented diplomatic immunity, religious tolerance, support for literacy, sciences, education, philosophy, massive infrastructure programs, postal systems, and so on. And that was very much imperial policy and very much what we'd look at the kind of regulatory logic of TB as such, maybe, or connected even more to B plus C, which I'll get to in a second. But at the exact same time, in order to bind together the actual political structure that would fight for and maintain this empire, Genghis Khan also essentially created Mongol nationality using these bodies that were called Kurultais, which were kind of collective, like giant collective camp assemblages that were formed in which the various kind of like local tribal leaderships would get together and anonymously elect the next leader. And basically attendance at the Kurultai was already a sign of favor for whatever leader you're getting behind. So at one and the same time, you had a very advanced and in a certain sense, even kind of modern imperial structure being developed and kind of social contract based upon an ethno-linguistic exclusive notion of Mongolian coming out at the exact same time, but being strictly separated both legally. So for example, non-Mongolian subjects of the empire were barred from learning the Mongolian language and therefore from participating in Kurultai. So there's a strict separation there. And there is a strict separation in terms of life. Most subjects became increasingly sedentary while the Mongolians maintained a nomadic lifestyle. And this very separation, I think, also accounts for the rapid collapse of the Mongolian Empire and its concentration to the four areas and the different ways that the four khanates developed in the coming centuries. So there's an interesting kind of like tension that develops there. I didn't get a chance to dig into it, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes out in terms of TC as well. But one of the things that I want to add in based on Gabriel's paper when he brought up status is one of the main things Genghis Khan did was restructure the fundamental status system, which distinguished between Aka and Ed, the elders and the youth, and created a more meritocratic system in which young people could actually get to senior positions if they demonstrated themselves effectively. So there's a lot in kind of shifts. And part of what I think is important there, which I still want to add in, but I'll get to these diagrams first, is the progressive, I guess you could say, or the constructive or the useful dimension of TB, is that part of why people got behind Genghis Khan was because the kind of kinship relationships on TA had developed into these kind of reified power relations that the Mongolian Empire actually offered new ways for peoples who weren't part of elite families or weren't part of a seniority network to get positions of power and demonstrate themselves continually to be innovative in all kinds of areas, from science to combat to all kinds of stuff. So the sovereign perspective, this is where I'd take out one of the three corners and kind of try to look at the social world from where the sovereign sits, kind of logically speaking. And this, to skip down here, maps on really well to the ways that power was actually divided and like the projects that were cut up, in particular this notion in Favrot's work, the Mongol Exchange, where you have the construction of a Mongol nation in ways that we consider very like classic ethno-linguistic, territorial, a direct kind of contract between a sovereign and a people. And you had the development of a global economy, which wasn't just simply commercial, but really prioritized religious, scientific, philosophical, et cetera, exchange that implemented a lot of what we now are calling like B plus C. And the particular position of the sovereign really had to like balance and mediate between those two demands, which again, I think can directly then give us a kind of logical mapping for the collapse of the Mongol Empire. It was precisely along these different lines that like the schisms between families and the breakdowns in the logistical infrastructure compounded one another and led to the fourfold breakup of the empire. So I kind of go into some,
Sorry, one question, John. In that diagram there, that would be, just go up a bit. This K here would be K with a B as a dominant, right? Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think that's, though and again,
Mhm.
because I'm trying to keep this minimal, but I think another interesting question that comes out of here is the Mongols kind of laid the groundwork for, or at least contributed heavily to the groundwork for the transition into capitalism. So there's also something about the way sovereignty was constructed that kind of pushed it there. And I don't think have time to get into that. But yeah, in terms of what the Mongol Empire was itself, yeah, we would talk about superscript B over AC. And therefore the dominance, I guess you could say, of this corner over the other two, right? So yeah, let me I kind of shot through a lot of stuff and I haven't really gone word for word, but I wanted to just kind of summarize.
No, but it's easier for us to read straight from the text also.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really good, I think, slicing of the diagram, because it's on like multiple different scales, the way it combines, even though it's like surrounded around TB. You have everything mixed in there well.
Cool.
I do wonder if we should think of either maybe like a name for the, I guess like what maybe call them like experimental sections, some way to make the reader realize that they're kind of more self-contained compared to.
I think that don't you think that if we have two sections coming before the diagram and then all other sections already have the diagram with like highlights or kind of partitions, it already suggests
yeah, that might be enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
No. I think Alan is not here, right? But I think that I spoke with him today, and I think his section will go really well with yours.
Yeah, I should probably reach out to him and see if we should touch base and maybe try to get on some common notes through this. I also, let me jump up here real quick. Just, I wanted to, and you brought this up, Gabriel, about like common, technical, using the same words. But kind of wanting to standardize like the references to like, are we just going to use like pure letters? Are we that concerned about standardization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we don't have an answer to that. I mean, I think it's easier to talk about that once we have all the sections and we see what we need, right? Because one thing I realized already is that some sections are quite heavy on like academic scholarly referencing, like Moscardis, who's writing on ecology. He has a lot of clear like academic referencing during the text. Other sections might not need it that much. Like I imagine Yasha's section doesn't need it so much.
Yeah, except for the few obvious ones.
Yeah, so I'm not like, I think that there's some standardization we can do once everything is written, like not to worry too much about it. What I think is more important actually is once we have the drafts, I wonder how much we should try. I mean, because it's good that these things can be kind of self-standing. They don't need to be totally coherent. Like you can see that different sections might have different presuppositions, or because you kind of need that to focus on different things, right? So I wonder how far we should go in trying to make them internally coherent amongst themselves, and how much we can just forget about that and just make the format the same, but not try to, let's say, create any standard of how much referencing or things like this. I think that things that refer to the diagram, they should be probably standardized, right? So the way of talking about A and B and like the notation and things like this. But more than that, I think it's up to us. Like one thing that I thought could be cool is to, once we have all the drafts, it's easier to see, let's say, concepts that pierce through. So for example, we can have, when certain concepts appear for the first time, or when they appear, we can have them like bold fonts, and then, instead of having footnotes, have the numbering of the other sections that also mention them, something like that, something that facilitates this feeling of cross-referencing. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe a common list of terminology.
Yeah.
Even though we're trying to not be too jargony.
But I think it's a good question, man. I'm not sure how to answer it.
Yeah, I think it makes sense for at least the notation to be standardized. And I think I liked some of the terms that you singled out around the different exchange transcendentals. So I think I just want to try to like a few of those same ones, like status,
Yeah.
or like institutions, like some of these words. So we just have a little bit of consistency.
Yeah, something like the back of logic of words with all those terminologies look good.
Yeah, but don't you think it's a bit too standardized for this? I mean, unless we want to have a dictionary at the end of the text, but
No,
I'm doing some of the defining, and Gabriel as well already in our section.
yeah,
So we could
I
always
will-
go back and like add or rework
Yeah.
things to fit more.
Yeah, I think we could. I think that's a really good question, and I think Reza's idea is also good. But probably we'll have a better feel for how far we need to go to make them internally coherent with one another once we have the drafts, right? Like I wouldn't worry so much about this while writing, because of course, if you've already read someone else's draft, you're taking it into consideration, it might give you ideas and so on. But since I think we're trying to bring more people together right now than they're used to talk about their different projects together, I think we should focus on making sure everyone finds a place, and then we can try to stitch them, you know, a bit more, just so it's not like an extra task you need to be thinking of.
cool.
Yeah, let's table. I mean, let's talk about this again.
Yeah.
On the 15th, I think.
Definitely.
So just to mention, since they're not here, but they have a lot to do with what John said. There are two sections of people we know are contributing, but they're not present today. One is Alain, who is writing about, let's say, what I think it would be fair to say that his basic question is, what would be a general concept of fetishism that is not so entangled to the commodity fetishism? So his doctorate thesis is about fetishism concerning state power. And he's also interested in fetishism when it comes to communal relations, but I think he's going to write about the fetish structures concerning state power relations. So I think it has a lot to do with what you're saying, John. Would be possibly like a pure B kind of cut, right? It doesn't concern B as a dominant mode, doesn't concern imperial formations or its relations to communities and to exchange. It just concerns this issue of, well, power operates in this way, through the sovereign, through this and that. But when you try to reduce it or isolate, for example, the sovereign out of that social network and take it to have internal properties of its own, the object itself, you tend to reify power as if it is connected to personhood, like to the juridical subject and things like this, right? So I think that's what he's going to write about. And Thiago, who is not here, I know he's writing something concerning mode A, again, a more pre-capitalist discussion of how, I forgot which tribe he's talking about, but he's talking about how we can apply this idea of special perspectives that see more about a social formation than our individual point of view, to explain how motherhood in matrilineal lineages are a privileged standpoint in some tribes, right? So it's like, I think it's from our cluster of papers is the one that deals the most with mode A. But I think neither Alain nor him added any drafts yet. But just to let you guys know.
So here, just because this is what you brought up last week, Gabriel, this was a very quick, and I'm not satisfied with it yet, but a first attempt to kind of bring up the idea of visibility and kind of like the different ways that space was constructed and shifted to bring about visibility. And so that's one place I've integrated something in terms of feedback. So if anyone else has thoughts or anything, it's good, but that's the core of the argument. So that's about what I've got.
I mean, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to meet up, if you want to meet up at some other time. Like I have to prepare a class on this topic for the course I'm giving. And I'm trying to base it on James Scott's Seeing Like a State, which I told you about. So I don't know, perhaps we could meet up at some point to talk it over and like just brainstorm some ideas. It could be useful.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm definitely down.
Yeah, so in our list of already drafted contributions, there is Rafael Moscardis one. He's not here, but you can find his draft in the folder. It's called Ecology in Karatani. His one is kind of you would say that it highlights the three modes, because his interest is in how each mode defines, like makes nature appear for itself. So Karatani already talks a lot about how animistic social formations and so on tend to constitute nature as a partner that you negotiate with. Magic has a place in it and other things, right? And then he wants to discern the way that state sees nature as a resource. So the logic of plunder and redistribution that dominating communities have with dominated ones is extended to the way nature is seen. So nature is also seen as a dominated community that is a resource that you need to manage and you need to protect back. So again, it's a sort of expansion of that mode of intercourse to nature. And then he wants to distinguish it from capitalism, because usually people don't make that distinction between how capital sees nature and how state sees nature, as if it's the same thing. So he wants to suggest that there is a different way that nature appears to capital than it appears to state. So it would be one that actually makes a section of the three things all at the same time in a way. Then there is yours, Dennis, right? I think that's the last one in the. I know there's also Renzo's. Both of yours have to do more with political organization, right?
Yeah, I was thinking mine could be maybe the conclusion or the last part. I'm not sure actually where it should fit in but it's kind of independent either way. Yeah, I could share my screen.
Let me. Here we go.
Yeah, let me. Actually, I don't have that much yet. I need to add the meat of the whole text, which is about the three different maps in our diagram: the against segregation, against expropriation, and I forgot the third one. Right? Exploitation. Right? Yeah, it's kind of an important one. Yeah. So I'll leave that to this next part here, but basically I think the theme that I want to play on, which from our conversation today, it's made it clear what I need to do, which is what are the practical like urgency that is created from organizational efforts that kind of necessitates this project and also brings about the synthesis itself, right? Like I really want us to, I think what really makes the project unique is that we're not starting from the assumption that we have some kind of whole theory that you can just apply our theory to every different political situation and suddenly you have this ready-made plan of action. It's rather that like we're building something that is able to synthesize the information that is created on the scene of a political struggle, right? So different political struggles are happening. We're creating this, like, think of it like kind of like a sponge that is able to absorb different types of political information together. And it's not just like the theory itself that will do that, but it's actually the tools that need to be built by these organizations to connect them, connect one another. That kind of forms this like practical side of the project. So here I start off with talking about like the need to build and share new interfaces between complex systems. And we kind of talked about this like, and also it's a lot of this text takes from the talk in that I gave in Palestine, right? This idea that you need to be able to find common ground between organizations, and you need to try to build this ecology of organizations, whatever that means, right? So yeah, I give this like definition of politics as the space for experimental creation of forms of intelligibility and interaction. So basically the different ways you poke at social reality need to somehow be integrated back together. Right. So like obviously this poking is happening regardless. It's not dependent on our theory. But what our theory can kind of help with is how to take these different pokings and kind of put them on the map together, right? And this diagram we have is one way, right? It's almost like a bookkeeping way of like taking data from different struggles and placing them on this map, so that now that we see them all together, we can start to build bridges between this data. So yeah, here I mentioned instead of tracing struggles to like individuals, we should read them as mapping out a certain organizational space, which has its own properties, right? That's how I'm thinking of this org, the domain of the maps, right? That we're building. We're trying to find the suitable space where all these pokings can kind of coexist together. Yeah, and then, Gabriel, you left some comments that I need to address here.
Yeah, it's not nothing big.
Yeah, it's basically the same. So yeah, basically like there's this certain processing of the data of the situation, if we want to use that metaphor. There's the analytic and the synthetic side of things. So like analytically, we need to be able to actually understand the systems we're interacting with. So all the stuff we're talking about with simulation, with dynamical systems, and the sciencey stuff, it has a place, right? Modeling has a place in the project, but that I would say it's only the analytic part of it. The synthetic part is like the construction of what I'm terming here as vehicles that hook into the various systems, and we can make use of the cybernetics stuff we've been talking about there, where there has to be a way to interact and then take in the results of that interaction in a new way, right? And then I mentioned this thing about like a left and right deviation, right? If you're too far to the left, your interaction is just orthogonal to the system you're trying to, you don't actually hook into it, or you are destructive. So you destroy the system, or the system destroys you, right? The interaction is not, doesn't yield any new information. That would be my definition of left deviation. And a right deviation would be something that, and it's a type of interaction that falls under the existing schema of that system. So it's not anything new. It's just like redundant. How the system are. Yeah, it's redundant to the system. It can be already be formulated in that system's language. So the goal is to find something that's neither of the two deviations, right? A new interaction that's not destructive and doesn't, but can't really be reducible to the system itself. Yeah, so I mentioned this thing about experiments between natural phenomena and so like natural phenomena already have this kind of independent status, so you can kind of isolate it, But the problem with political experiments is that you're part of that experiment, right? You can't really separate yourself from a political experiment the way a scientist can separate themselves from a scientific one. So there's that, to answer that question about like what is really a political experiment. Like part of the experiment is to construct the object you're experimenting with, right? You're saying like, I want to make an experiment that involves the working class, but the working class is kind of it's not pre-given the way that some like fragment of nature might be. So that's also a constraint, right? Okay, so all that goes into this next section about pathologies of the left. I don't know. I think maybe this whole part is a bit too general for. I might cut down some of this or move it. Let's see.
Yeah, a decent section of that is a little bit in dialogue with my introduction.
Yeah.
I think it's
Mhm.
So I'll probably be referencing to it, especially in the organization section.
And also my entry there as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's a lot
Carlin's
for
entry.
this final section. Yeah.
Wait,
Yeah.
can I get clarification again from you, Karan, what exactly you want to cover also? Once you're ready. Or can I just get another clarification of what you want to cover so we can separate?
Yeah, it's just
yeah.
the thing is, I want to uphold, of course, as the project states, a certain autonomy of organization, but the organizations are appearing also to individuals, right? So it is basically this problem that Dennis is saying, was stated in a certain sense. How does the organization appeal to the individual that is building the organization? And this can be parsed out. I was parsing out this question as a Salarzian critique of Zonrettel. Zonrettel has this idea that, social forms give the transcendental subject its categories, right? So it's not coming from the mind, but it is in the mind. So this famous turn of phrase, not in the mind, but not from it, is what I'm trying to address. So it has to do with the kind of pathway between objective phenomenology and, you can call it maybe a subjective phenomenology. Or
sorry, Karen, did you say
of a cognitive subject?
sorry to interrupt. Did you say the famous phrase, in the mind, not from the mind?
Yeah, in the mind, but not from it.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Like it's the basic Zonrettel idea that, there are basically the real abstractions give the transcendental subject is categories. So he's trying to give materialist basis for instance, Kantian philosophy. But the problem is that he's presupposing as well that there are subjects that are able to perform certain operations, like to, trade goods in the market, for instance. He even says like, the man who goes to the market and trade goods goes with his dog, and the dog does not trade goods, you see. So there is a presupposition of certain kinds of abilities, which is something that, I think most of you know that it's something important for me, like the presentations on space of reasons and, Salarzian philosophy and all of that. So it's a kind of a Salarzian critique of Zonrettel, but it's not a critique in the sense of disproving the hypothesis of real abstraction. No, it's just trying to modulate and trying to bring forward what is the mediation that makes possible something that is an abstraction that is in action, in a social formation, to be transmitted to the mind.
Yeah, I think Zonrettel calls this the conversion problem.
Yeah, kind of conversion problem. Yep. So this is the issue, basically.
Yeah, it really fits.
And then, of course, the natural language enters into it, and the whole shebang. So some of you know already what I'm up to usually. So this is it. So in a certain sense, it is. I think it is in the point of view of political experimentation. Yes. But it is in the point of view of political experimentation as experienced by those who are in the political experiment. Something like that. And it came mostly from my experience at the CSII, basically. The fact that there is a kind of protocol that is a desubjectivizing protocol, but at the same time, we are part of the desubjectivizing protocol, and the protocol is making us do stuff, and we are retroactively reading the tendencies that the protocol make explicit. So it is about this knowledge feedback between, the individuals that are part of the political experiment and the political experiment itself.
So did you say that it kind of fits in sections B and C of the first part that Yasha is working on?
Yeah, I had the impression that it's just something that Gabriel was discussing in the beginning, that section C was kind of about this. I think Dennis was talking also about this, that had something to do with this. So I think mine too would have something to do with that. Like there's something, there's some overlap, thematic overlap.
I don't think it's a matter of inclusion.
Not necessarily.
So I'm wondering,
identical. The treatment, I don't feel that the treatment might have to be identical.
No,
in any way, but there is some thematic overlap there.
But since this is introduction for the entire section, I'd like to earlier point, if we knew a little bit more about that, this could, whatever section that we are writing could be an intro or a lead to what you expand in your treatment. So
I think especially when we go back, we'll cross-reference things. But I think I have a general idea of
I have a bunch of stuff already. I can send you. I gave a talk about this like 3 weeks ago. It's on YouTube, so I can link you to that. And there is also the PowerPoint presentation, so we can just have a chat about this. The material is already, assembled. I have to write down a version that will be in Portuguese, a full version in Portuguese for the Crisis and Critique. But then I think it's feasible to do like a shorter version, to be a section on this text. I think it's feasible.
Yeah, and I think once we have like the drafts, like in 10 days, it's much easier to like know what we can anticipate, what can just be referenced. Like that part of it, I think it's easier down the line, right? Otherwise, you guys, again, might become too worried about already preparing the ground for what Caron's going to write. It takes you extra work. Like, I tend to think that strategy of each one writes their thing, and then we try to revise and cross-polish.
I agree with Gabriel on that. I think it's not necessary to, announce the thing with the terms that I'm using and the kind of thing that I'm using. I think the thematic overlap is strong enough in a certain sense to be like a particular treatment of a theme, a problem. Right. And I quite like. I'm not sure if it's the best way to put it in, like to create a little extra node there in the diagram, or if I'm doing A plus C modes of sorts. I'm not sure.
I think it could.
I'm divided on that. I'm not sure where. Maybe org, maybe A plus C, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I have a very crazy idea on how we could add this, but I think it would require so much more work that we shouldn't go into it now. But like, there is a question of how would you we could construct a definition of a bit more robust definition of what we call a sort of cognitive space, and then actually map org back into it. Like, for example, we know that what has maximal value of appearing or maximal truth value in the topos of organization is not my consciousness or not myself or not something that is guarantees my self-identity, right? Whereas in my
that's-
cognition,
yeah.
that has a very high, so there could be like a weird functorial description of, but it's just mad scientist stuff. We
Yeah,
probably
but I
need.
agree with that line of, I agree with that line of investigation, but
Yeah.
maybe it's too.
And it's amazing
little
because you
time
could
to get
even go
into
as far as saying like, you need to have an area of the cognitive space that is, that captures the structure, because otherwise cognitive agents couldn't be part of the organizational structure. But that, let's say, lower structure in cognitive practical abilities can be, let's say, maximally valid for the organizations, though they're never as maximal for the cognitive.
Exactly, yeah.
Like you could actually have a
This-
cross
this-
weird thing.
Yeah, it is a weird crossing. I mean, what is interesting is that obviously organization is causally much more efficacious than individuals, but organizations at the same time wouldn't be there without individuals, like
Of course, yeah.
without the cognitive individuals, because it's built up by their seeing as, at the same time they are not seeing as necessarily in the correct way, which is kind of interesting, like the kind of consequences that are not, similar to what is expected by the cognitive point of view, even though the material of the thing is kind of involves the cognition.
Yeah,
So
this could be really cool, though it's.
This is my interest, my basic interest. I mean, in developing now. Yeah.
I think other than this, there is Renzo's, and Rafael, I know Saldanha wants to also propose something. So I think we have, I also wanted to propose an extra one, but I don't think I'll have time to work on it. But perhaps Renzo, you could talk a bit about what you were thinking of.
Yeah, I'll have to leave soon, but I added some scribbles. It's in Portuguese, but just to maybe give a general picture of what I was thinking about, I'm trying to sort of take stock and like develop a perspective on this cycle of career strikes that have been happening in Brazil for the last year. There have been like national strikes, but also like more local regional strikes. And I was thinking to use it as a sort of like case study for the approach, like trying to apply it would fit, I think, on the against exploitation, like sort of organization with the arrow to TC, right? Because it would be basically a strike movement. So an attempt to negate TC, and what sort of organization is able to do that. And I sort of sketched like maybe the idea would be to have like a section on applying the triad of composition, interaction, and intelligibility. So there would be problems of how like work in like the platform work and gig economy that is basically shapes and is transforming the sector in Brazil, how this sort of composition shapes the way that both conflict and organization appears and develops. Then something on how, what does interacting with a platform, like an Uberized platform, that like an algorithm, how do you even interact with that? How do you interrupt that if you like, you cannot hack it, or you have to, it's not even clear when you strike what sort of effect you're like producing on the platform, right? So, and this appears like concretely in the struggle. So I think that could be interesting to talk a little bit about that. So it's like a dual problem of how certain, so another example is when you had like strikes on factories, the sort of space in which the action appeared was more restricted, I think. And with the career strikes, they often have to have the scale of this, right? So the condition on the sort of like space organized is given by the size of the city. So we have only been seeing like strikes a medium, like strikes of more than 1 day on like medium-sized cities, and not on like really big cities like São Paulo. And I think it's very related on the challenges of having to organize a strike in a city like São Paulo or like Rio. So that would like discuss a bit the problem of scale and visibility, I think. And then I thought about also discussing a bit the problem of representation and of how the movement is able. So in the context of this fragmentation of work, you don't have like, how do you represent your own actions, and how do you, so you have this interesting problem of like the way that people use WhatsApp groups to sort of like circulate small videos of actions that are like happening across in like a city that's on strike. But then you also have the problem of say how it appears to the outside, and then it appears on the social network, which has a different like composition, and so you have, I think I would,
yeah, I think you should highlight the whole thing.
yeah, of the diagram.
Yeah, I think you should just color the whole thing.
I think it would be like, I'm not sure if it would be like more examples trying to illustrate like problems that we approach, something like that.
Do you think you could, sorry to interject, just a stupid question in the sense, like, do you think you could relate this to the structure of supply chain networks of capital? Like basically, because like the topology for capitalist production is often different than the way people in communities organize on the ground. So strikes are not often matching well in some sense to like the structures that they strike against. They can only strike, like, you can only strike against this factory, and like modern corporations like are built in a way that they can evade striking blockades, and in a sense they're very flexible and international. So while you have to focus locally, your topology doesn't match the topology of capital in a way. And I think what labor organizers would like to have is a very good understanding of how they could coordinate an international strike or something like this, or a national strike or whatever. You can maybe just pick like, I think nowadays actually it's very fragile. You can maybe pick like a few places, and if you would be able to strike there, you could like take down a whole sector or something like this, right? But it's not so easy to see these connections for people who are organizing on the ground. So I suspect that this would be practically even like potentially helpful. I don't know whether this is crazy or not, or out of scope, I guess. But
no, yeah, I think it's totally related. Like in Brazil, we had like since in 2013, like the biggest like protests were related to like the price of the bus, but like the actions themselves were related to interrupting like the flows, the streets, right? So it seems that like all political action has sort of shift from like the workplace and the factories and move towards like the spaces of circulation of commodities and people. And then we had also like truck strikes, and so I think it's related to how like these channels of circulation support like interrupting those places is actually a way to interrupt like many logical levels of and scales of the functioning of capital today, in a way that just interrupting like a single place wouldn't work anymore. Like there's no sort of efficacy to that. So
yeah,
I think
I feel like Dennis's section should come before yours. Then Dennis said that perhaps it should be the last one, but probably yours could be to come after his. You know, like he's discussing this in a more abstract way.
Yeah, I was because I thought about like trying to read Dennis to try to sort of like map, to sort of apply and make concrete some of Dennis' notions.
Cool.
So
we should work. Yeah, we should work together on this one, because I think you have a good perspective on exactly the thing about the synthesizing parts of the world through actions, right? So like the three maps we proposed, against segregation, against exploitation, or whatever, that these maps have to be glued together. And exactly, like, seems like planning a strike is like mapping a space that or coordinating some kind of action requires gluing together a lot of different pieces of information. So it's a very concrete way to imagine this kind of construction process.
Yeah. And I was also thinking about discussing a bit what then like a militant orientation would mean, given like this organizational perspective, like what is actually, what is the kind of work that a militant does. And I think it would be related to like producing like connections and making stuff intelligible and being able to construct like
Renzo, if you wanna work on that, I mean, after I read Dennis's section, I wrote something for, like, Dennis and I were thinking about how to structure an introduction to a book based on these topics. And I wrote an introduction that was trying to show that the actual definition of communist in the Communist Manifesto is very close to the stuff we're doing, but I just give like a rereading of it based on this. Perhaps I could just send it to you and we can just have it as a separate thing, because it looks like it could take its own heading, you know, for that last question, perhaps.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep on writing, and then I could discuss with you and Dennis maybe, and then see where it goes.
I think Rafael had an idea. Rafael, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just a little.
You're in the middle of a move.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of things, but yeah, my idea isn't too fleshed out. Actually, I was very unsure how I would work myself in this project, but after talking to Gabriel, I think in the weekend, he gave me an idea to recover some stuff I was working on in the beginning of the year, especially thinking through Patricia Reed's work on perspective. I think it chimes a lot with what Caron is working also. So I think we're going to have to talk, and
I was expecting that already. I was expecting that.
Yeah. So, but what I was thinking, and I'm very sorry, but yeah, as Gabriel said, I was moving and I'm in the middle of a job interview, and I took some notes from what you were talking, and I think maybe I would try to experiment and adapt what Patricia Reed talks about, multi-scalarity and whatnot, to the Karatani scheme. So I'm thinking if there's a way, especially with the diagram which you guys made, I think I'm going to try to see if what I have written down is, well, the questions are huge as always, but one thing I thought was that I was thinking, especially, I wanted to be at the meeting where you talked about TV shows, etc., because I think that's actually perfect. Because in a way, I think every grouping, every possible grouping, there's some sort of, it's a loaded word, but ideology that emerges from the specific slice. And I think what concerns me is the specific transition from this ideology to a sort of critique of ideology, which is what I've been working on and off in the past few years. So what I was thinking is trying to see if I can work with Patricia Reed's, well, with her stuff, and see if it's possible to take up Karatani's challenge of thinking through the Borromean knot all the way with the three elements, and with the decomposing that you guys have structured, and to see if there's a way to tackle the problem of how a critique emerges in a certain sense, but not from a particular a particular slice, but maybe from how these slices interact, or well, it's not very well thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
for
this looks like you're using her what she develops as futurity and the friction between worlds, right? Like in the end of a world and its pedagogies. Like a certain critique comes about because there's a friction that between some kind of world and another world, which can't be integrated by the way the world is at a specific point.
Mhm.
Yes, something like that, right? Okay, I understand.
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to try to do is try to see how that maps into Karatani, to see what kind of friction emerges if we take if we give a more concrete definition to the multiple worlds that are actually colliding. Because I think the problem, and this is what I enjoyed much about this project, is that when we talk about multi-scales, multi-worlds, multi-whatevers, is that they're either too singular in a sense that you can't really do anything with them, because I can't be, I mean, I can't see a tiger drinking beer or whatever. So I think it restricts movement too much. So I'm thinking that if you can take this cosmopolitical principle and try to map it into Karatani, it something worthwhile might come up. So that's what I think I'm going to work on starting next week, because this week just got a bit
because of
longer,
mayhem reasons.
But yeah, exactly. But I'm excited, so I hope.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because Patricia is already mixing like the concept of world from Badiou and from Goodman, which is like already kind of this.
Yeah,
mongrel.
yeah. I feel like
So,
what you were writing, what Rafael would be writing, they really go well together as well.
Yeah, and now you're putting in Karatani, so it's going to be a three-headed monster, not just a two-headed one. Yeah.
Well, assuming that we're not trying to do, I'm still not convinced we shouldn't, but assuming we're not going to try to do the TV series, the TV guide. Last week we proposed that we should do like TV series suggestions for each part of the diagram. Like clearly, The Wire is KC, you know, Sopranos is A+C. Parks and Recreation is A+B. You can like do for each of them and like do a little TV guide of structures of feeling. But either that or some. Sorry,
Where does the Squid Game fit in?
My opinion is that the Squid Game is very overrated. I think it's.
It's a poor man. The Squid Game is a poor man's 3%.
Yeah, exactly. It's like A+C, but kind of very poor model. I don't know. But there is something I thought, I mean, I wanted to run past by you guys. I thought of doing, I mean, there are two things I think we could add to the text, just because we know we're like doing a weird presentation with a bunch of stuff, but also we want to see if people get interested in this, right? So there are two things I thought we could add to the text. I can mention them again on the WhatsApp since a lot of people are not here anymore. But one of them is that we could have a section just about, like at the end or at the beginning, just have something telling people that the group is open, people can join in, like just a general invitation. I think it's something worth writing, because the fact that you can come from a different kind of background and it fits. It's something that the very text is kind of putting to the test. So we could write something about it, like a one-page invitation. But something else I thought which could be a bit more enticing for the very nerdy people is the following. Let me just share my screen here. This is
I think also that one-page invitation can probably be like synthesized with like the proper with like a proper intro, I guess, like right before my intro, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just be at the beginning,
saying this is who we are, this is the context, get ready.
Yeah, exactly. Probably. But what I was gonna say is that one thing we didn't talk about today, but we're gonna do anyway, right? There's one extra section that Dennis and I were gonna do just on the primer, like a short summary of the basic idea of the primer, just so we have something purely on C, because if you just see everything we spoke of right now, so you have org here, right? We mentioned Thiago is writing about A. John is writing about all of this. The primer is we're gonna write about this. We're still seeing, like, so Dennis is writing about this, and we could say that perhaps Renzo is writing about this. Rafael Moscardi is writing about the difference between nature in these two modes. I think that Caron, we can either just add him as being here as well, or we can add an extra point to add this mapping that actually helps with both Rafael's and Caron's point, right? Like how this is mapped here and how do you navigate this complex social system in the case of Rafael. But behind all of this, there is a technical issue, which is we've been thinking about, like, we managed to formalize a lot of interesting things about mode C, departing from the idea that this transcendental here is intuitionistic, right? It has this multiple values of truth, right? We have also a theory about mode B that it is classical. So TB is either 0 or 1. And we were having a bit of trouble finding a good, we had an intuitive explanation of why A is more paraconsistent. It has these 3 values for true, false, and neither of the, in both at the same time, right? Whatever you want to have here as well. But we didn't know how to go about this very well. And recently we found a text that helps to defend the thesis that this is a hiking algebra, the sub-object specifier. This is a Boolean one. And this is a Breuer algebra, which is a paraconsistent algebra for topos theory. So we kind of found what goes here. So I thought that nice.
Can you remind me which text this was?
Yeah, I'll send you a bunch of them. Like
Yeah.
I've gotten obsessed over this for the last couple of weeks. It's and a lot of theories, a lot of interesting stuff was already done. For example, between the relation between these two, because Breuer algebras are co-hiking algebras, so they're duals. And Boolean logic algebras are self-duals. So there's a lot of stuff there, but we don't know yet how we can talk about these things. So I thought of adding an open question, like a challenge to the reader, challenge to the nerd reader. Like, we have a vague idea of these ideas. We have no idea how to navigate around them formally. Like, whoever finds out, please send us a text, like send us a message or something. So I thought if that was a other way to be kind of inviting to other people, but in a different way.
Is that what you were adding, the open questions on topo and complex?
Yeah,
worlds?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. We can probably work on that as like a short thing.
Yeah, I mean, my idea was if you have time, but I think since it's a bit out of the format, like because it's a section that is directed towards the reader, right? You'd be like, this is an open question to make this approach consistent. Like,
yeah,
the sort of
it
thing
could even be an appendix at the end.
Yeah,
in case
exactly.
we want to
Something
add
like
a tiny bit of jargon.
Yeah, exactly. Because we only go into the more formal stuff when we're talking about the primer. All the other sections are a bit less formal. But this is a technical issue that, in a certain way, everything kind of hinges on it. So it would be nice to show like the worst kind of frailty, like, look, this is a big, concrete, localized issue you can help out with, And I think that just putting it to paper wouldn't take that much. Like a couple of pages should be enough. It would have nice diagrams and arrows. I mean, who doesn't love arrows? So it could be an interesting thing to add, And I do think that at some point we would have any way to stop and talk about it, because it's a really crazy kind of new line of study in topos theory that it's not true. I mean, from these guys, they conclude that it's not true that you should assume that topos logic is naturally intuitionistic. It's very interesting. So I don't know if we want to go totally crazy.
Some extra time to help out with that at the end.
Yeah, let's meet and
Yeah.
And see if we can come up with.
Okay, cool. This helped clarify a lot. I'm ready to write now properly.
Good. Yeah. I mean, if we're honest about it, we probably have a book here. Probably gonna.
Yeah, a small one.
Yeah, a little booklet.
Or even a big one.
Yeah. Also, I mean, we already fucked up lengthwise. They told us just do whatever size of text you guys want, so it's on them.
I think it's gonna be bigger than they expect.
Yeah, I think it's bigger than they expect, but forgetting for one moment that they might hate it in terms of the size. I send you guys through the WhatsApp group just a couple of snapshots of the last printed edition that they did. Like they really take an effort, like, and it's filled with diagrams and stuff. So I think we can be like excessive with that stuff as well, not be too cautious, and that's fine. You know, if we want to have images and stuff, like they seem to be interested in adding a bunch of noise to their text.
Cool.
Great. Okay, so I think now that I think of it, I think we have 11 sections planned.
Do we?
Yeah, between 11 or 12.
How many pages per section are expected?
Okay.
Yeah, we're trying to do like keep it under 7.
We're trying to keep most of them.
It is a book already, like 100
Yeah, and
pages.
originally we were
Almost
saying
100.
keep it under 4.
Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, I think everyone should aim to keep it like around 4 pages. That would be amazing. And if we fail, because there is a small chance that they're just gonna come back to us and say this is too long.
Yeah,
I think you'll be scared, which is not a problem because we can just fucking have a shorter version and have like a website up with everything. It might even be a better format. So even the worst case scenario.
Go back through, and because there might be a lot of redundancies between sections.
Yeah.
With cross-referencing and things that might help.
Yeah, but it's not hard to imagine that, you know, if Efren gets psyched into writing something, if other people are up for writing something, it could easily go over 100 pages, and perhaps they want to publish as a separate thing, you know, rather than as a text. We don't know. So
yeah, okay.
Someone can write a review of Squid Game and A+C.
Yeah, it's a good thing we don't have like 2-3 months, because I'm sure we would just come up with like random sections to add, like TV guides and food that goes with it, like representative food.
I think the TV guide is the best intro possible, but
I'm not sure if it's too cringe for people, but I honestly think it would be a good idea, like a really short thing. Everyone pitches in, we can just have like, you know, and I love that we came up with the conclusion that Twin Peaks is the only TV show that is about mode A and nothing more. Like it's as if state and capital don't exist, they're only personal relations. That's why it's so crazy. Like if you try to pretend like nothing else exists, what you get is this metaphysical backdrop, right? Everywhere where infrastructure should appear, abstract domination should appear, you get metaphysical unease. And the only real thing are personal relations. I think that's a really strong thesis, in fact.
Yeah, Twin Peaks perhaps, but I'm thinking about David Lynch's world more generally. Like in Mulholland Drive, you get, you know, studio suits that decides things, and the guy is oppressed by suits. Yeah, but for example,
the rationality, right? Remember the scene where they decide this is the girl, right?
Yeah, for instance.
Yeah, but it's totally like opaque, right? The reasoning. These guys are like from another planet.
But isn't this kind of something that is part of abstract domination, so in certain sense?
Yeah, no,
we
I
don't
think
really
that's
know why. I mean,
exactly. But I think that it's not for nothing that he's a genius of this sort of abstract unease, because he's totally uninterested in the actual structure, right?
Yeah.
I like Zizek says that David Lynch invented a ridiculous sublime. Like, it's totally ridiculous, it's totally pedestrian, but it has no structure behind it, so it becomes weirdly sublime, right? The guy spitting the coffee, and like, why are you doing that? Like, why did you choose this girl over the? Like, everything becomes so existentially horrendous, right? Other authors would just, artists would just like name names, like, this guy's doing it because it will make money. Like, no, why is he choosing the girl? And the FBI agents, like, they work through mysticism.
I was going to,
If you've seen his paintings, they give a very similar vibe.
It's true.
Which scene? What? Sorry?
His paintings.
His paintings. Have you seen his paintings? He was originally a painter. Yeah.
And for example, if you move the structure of feeling of Twin Peaks to X-Files, like X-Files, the abstract structure of the state becomes concrete. And now it's only capital that has no face, like no name. So everything which has to do with parasitic things that exploit people, they become alien, right? And the state gains form. So you could say like Twin Peaks is A, X-Files is A plus B. That works, man. Like, you could do it for everything. It'd be really cool.
Mad Men is a good A plus C, I think.
Yeah, Mad Men could go there as well.
So it'll just have to be the sequel to this paper, I guess.
Yeah.
An analysis of every.
Also, I mean, at some point we need to discuss titles, right, for the paper. Like.
True.
But we can do that some other time. Anyway, guys, I need to run anyway. I need to
okay. See ya.
Christian, it was a pleasure meeting you, man. Hope we can chat more.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Christian.
See everyone.
See you.
See you later.
Great meeting, guys.
Great meeting. Bye.